updating our climate action plan to create essentially a new plan to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the county. I'm going to talk about the CAP update, and then I'll also talk about briefly about two other initiatives led by my colleagues at the county. First off, what is the CAP? Our CAP is a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the county to help mitigate for climate change. The CAP quantifies GHG emissions from the 5 sectors shown here, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about agriculture later in my presentation. The jurisdiction of the CAP, or excuse me, the county, as you know, as you see it here, is quite a large area, but the jurisdiction of the CAP is much more constrained than that. The jurisdiction of the CAP only covers the areas where the county has land use authority. So essentially all the blue areas here. So you take out incorporated cities, you take out tribal, federal, and state lands, and then you have where we cover for all the development and all the activities in the unincorporated county, as well as all of the county facilities and fleets, regardless of location. So for example, the County Administrative Center in downtown San Diego is covered in our climate action plan, even though it's not in the unincorporated area in blue here. So preparing the CAP takes a few steps. First, we collect data to create an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. Next, those emissions are projected out through 2050 to estimate emissions that would have been generated without any of the action or without the climate action plan. Finally, we set goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and these are set for us by the state. We have a target to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. And we also have a board directed goal to achieve net zero by 2035 or 2045. That gap that you see is what we need to reduce in terms of emissions. We do that with what we call measures. Measures are specific actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they have certain requirements that just try to appear on the screen because our CAP is mitigation for the build out of the county's general plan. So it essentially accounts for all the emissions associated with county activities, like I mentioned, and build out of that plan. So to qualify as being mitigation measures, they have to be quantifiable. So we have to be able to understand how much GHG emissions can be reduced. We have to have the jurisdictional authority. So like I mentioned, it has to be within where we have land use authority, or it has to be from our facilities or from our fleets. We have to be able to monitor the reductions over time. So we can't just say we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and then be done with it. We have to actually track it over time. And then they must be additional to things that would have occurred otherwise. So if somebody else is going to reduce GHG emissions on their own, or if there are state or federal regulations that require us to reduce emissions, we cannot take credit for those. So now specifically for the agricultural sector, most of the sector agriculture and conservation accounted for 5% of emissions based on our 2014 inventory. So from all those 5 sectors that I showed you earlier, ag and conservation is relatively small, but it is still considerable in terms of its impact on climate change. Most of those emissions come from agricultural equipment, but they also come from other sources such as livestock, application of fertilizer, things like irrigation pumps as well. So knowing where these sources of emissions come from help us to understand how we can address those emissions through what I mentioned are measures. So knowing where the emissions come from help inform what kind of specific actions we can take to reduce those emissions. Ideally, we will find ways to not only reduce the emissions, but also support community benefits, things like growing the economy, growing green jobs, and supporting sustainable farming practices. I want to mention that our last plan from 2018 did not account for the potential to sequester carbon, kind of like our former colleague mentioned in terms of carbon sequestration, capturing carbon within soil, within plants, within trees as well. However, this time around, we are evaluating how we can capture and sequester carbon. So that's going to inform the types of action that we could potentially take to reduce emissions. couple examples from our 2018 plan. As I mentioned, we have a plan currently in place, and then we're updating it to go above and beyond what we did in the 2018 plan. 3 specific actions or measures that are related to agriculture are shown here, which is one is through our PACE program, the purchase of agricultural conservation easements. And we have a goal to purchase or to place nearly 5,000 acres of agricultural easements by 2030. And then we have 2 other incentive programs that are administered by our colleagues that spoke earlier at the Air Pollution Control District, Eric and Nikki. And one of those is related to agricultural equipment, and another is related to ag pumps. We are active in a bunch of other areas as well. So since 2018, here are some of the accomplishments that we've done, including helping install solar panels, conserving open space, planting trees, distributing grain barrels, and with doing all that work, we hit our 2020 goal, and we're still making progress and hoping that we can also hit our 2030 goal, even though that's a while off. We're still working on it. By then, we'll actually have our CAP update in place, and then we'll have the more ambitious actions that we're going to take in that plan. So in terms of next steps and what to expect is that we are conducting outreach actually throughout the entire process that we've been updating it, which started last year. We've gone to the public and a number of public workshops and had stakeholder meetings, one-on-one meetings, and meetings with groups. I think we met with the Farm Bureau on at least a couple of occasions. And so I'll show my contact information later, but please feel free to email me if you'd like to schedule a meeting, if you'd like to talk with my team or me about your ideas for how the climate action plan can help support greenhouse gas emission reductions in your work. So as mentioned earlier, we do an inventory to start to see where we are, get a snapshot of where we are and where we're going. We've completed that for the most part. We're just waiting for data from SANDAG to estimate emissions from the transportation sector. Then currently we're working on all the actions that will form our measures to which will actually kind of be the heart of the plan. So we're figuring out right now what we're going to do, how we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're taking those to the public. It's actually starting next week, next Wednesday evening. We're going to have a virtual workshop on solid waste. So everybody's invited. There's the link right there. I'll also put up my email, so you can feel free to email me if you have it, if you'd like me to send you the invitation. And then later this summer, we'll have workshops for each one of those other sectors. So agriculture and conservation will have a workshop probably in late July, if you're interested in joining. Now, real quickly, 2 other programs administered by colleagues in my division. Here they are. First is Organics Materials Ordinance Update. I'm going to go really quickly through this one and the next one, but I'll provide contact information for my colleagues in case you're interested in learning more about these 2. This one, we call it the OMO Update, Organics Materials Ordinance Update, is essentially designed to make it easier to compost organic materials in the unincorporated county. As you can see from this chart here, based on a survey from landfill waste composition, the largest single type of waste that was found was organic waste. And organic waste is troublesome because it decomposes and it forms methane. And methane is much more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So if we can capture that, it has quite a bit of impact. Or well, if it gets released, it worsens climate change, and if we can capture it, all the better. The goals of this program are to divert that organic waste to reduce the GHG emissions that are generated from it, also to protect public health and safety, create clear standards for people who do want to compost, like for example on-site on-site composting, and it will also help us the county advance sustainability goals. The other program I'd like to tell you about briefly is the Native Plant Landscaping Policy Options. The goal here is to support some of these benefits that you see on the slide of biodiversity, water conservation, etc. But essentially, it's just about getting more native plants in the ground and landscaping. And this is not it doesn't have a dictated outcome yet. This is for policy options. So it could be, so some of the outcomes of it could be things like guidelines or requirements for landscaping, or it could be things like incentives for retrofits, or things like resources and training. For example, training to help people learn how to grow and maintain native plants in a nursery that can then be sold on the local market. Oh, and the recommendations are currently being developed by the San Diego Regional Biodiversity Working Group, and those the recommendations from that group are actually anticipated in the next couple of weeks. So like I mentioned, here I have contact information for myself as well as my two colleagues. Tyler Farmer is the one who manages the organics materials ordinance update. Megan Kelly manages the native plant landscaping options. And I'm Joseph Cryer. But I put the email here on the top. That's cap@sdcounty.ca.gov. That's our general inbox that we're all in one team, so it goes to all of us. So if you have a question about the CAP update or about any of those other policies, you can go ahead and send an email there. And happy now. I think we have a couple minutes left over to take in your questions or comments. And I have a card as well. I can give you my card, and you can write me and let me know if you're interested in attending one of our upcoming workshops.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, so when you did the original inventory, and you identified sources, did you also identify sinks?
Yes, that is part of this CAP update. So that was not something that was done in the 2014 inventory, but this time it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so you looked at, because that was one of the things, that we've looked at in agriculture is, I think the number is over the past decade, we've lost about 1 million avocado trees, which are amazing sequesters of carbon. And so I'm just curious if the county's paying attention to how can we maintain, because it's always cheaper for a farmer to grow it than it is to do landscape trees and have the county pay for it. If consideration is being given to that, as well as the 100,000 acres of rangeland we have.
Absolutely. So in the inventory, we have did a special analysis this time looking at different land use types and coverage types and what kind of values are associated with land use coverages for potential GHG sequestration, both I believe on the agricultural side and also for natural lands, like looking at scrub lands, wooded areas and what their different values are. But that's absolutely, that's kind of feedback that we want to hear and that we want to incorporate and find ways to, when I talk about creating measures that support sequestration, that support GHG reduction, that's exactly what we want to take advantage of. So I'm happy to talk more about that, of how we can support our farmers and so that they can keep trees, that sequester carbon, for example. That's what we want to talk to folks about.
So is that on your website now, that updated inventory?
The inventory is not. Our inventory is still, sorry, I should have clarified more. It's not 100% complete. We're still waiting on data from SANDAG, the Regional Transportation Agency, to conduct their analysis, or so we can model transportation emissions. And transportation emissions are about 45% of emissions in the region. So without that, we still only have about half of an inventory complete. So we won't release that most likely until our draft plan is out early next spring. Yes.
When you talk about the ordinances that are being reviewed in terms of allowing on-site composting, what is the status of that? It's one of the big barriers that I saw we were having here. Just farms are not allowed to receive food waste for third parties. So I was wondering if an unincorporated county there's already conversations about what are the regulations that are going to be reviewed just to facilitate this for farmers to create their own.
Yes. So I'll mostly have to defer to my colleague Tyler Farmer on that. But I can tell you that they are leading an public outreach engagement process as part of this. So they've been when was their last workshop? I think they had a workshop just in the last couple of weeks. But we can exchange contact information and I can get you in contact with them. But what they're doing is kind of same thing that we're doing with the climate action plan update is we want to hear from people because, you know, we're good at our specific jobs, but we don't know all the different ways that we're going to, you know, the potential impacts of the policy. So that's why we want to talk with folks and be like, all right, how can we make a policy that works for you? So I'll just have to defer that to him and just let you know that we are doing outreach and happy to get your feedback. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were replacing ag easements. What are you replacing with?
So with ag easements, that is part of the purchase of agricultural conservation easements program with the county. It's called PACE. There's another PACE program with the state, but they're different. And it's too bad my colleague was sitting here. She actually helps manage that program, Stephanie Neal. That program is a voluntary program for farmers to get a subsidy or get payment essentially to put an agricultural easement on their land so that they keep it as agricultural land instead of converting it to development. So if you have a piece of land and you're like, I want to keep this as a farm, as agricultural land, the county will help you, help make that an easier economic decision.
I have a couple questions. You mentioned one of the goals was to the ability to monitor reductions. How does
Yes.
the county see what kind of investment's going to go into that? Are you looking at hiring more people to monitor? I mean, how do you see that as it relates to agriculture?
As it relates to agriculture, it depends on the program. So the examples earlier from Eric and Nikki were the Carl Moya, or actually that's a state one, but the replacement of agricultural pumps and the replacement of off-road vehicles. Those would be monitored through their specific program. So they have, they would, as you mentioned, we check up on these on the equipment, make sure that it's actually in use. And so like for actually our purposes, so they monitor that, they have all that information, and then we coordinate with them every year. We publish an annual monitoring report. Next one should be out in a couple of weeks for 2021. But what we get from them is they would tell us, for example, we've replaced this many agricultural pumps, diesel pumps with, or irrigation pumps with diesel pumps with electric pumps. And then we have like an emissions factor essentially that's associated with that. So for every irrigation pump that's replaced, that's X amount of emissions reduced. And so that kind of goes throughout the different, we have 26 measures currently. Some of the other measures would be like tree planting from the county. And that's actual, like our Parks and Recreation Department. They track the number of trees that they plant throughout the county. It was something like 4,500 trees last year. Solar installations on homes, we track the number of permits. So it's through that.
A number
Oftentimes
of them are focused on reduction, avoidance, removal, meaning carbon sequestration. How do you see yourselves monitoring carbon sequestration throughout the county?
carbon sequestration, that would depend measure by measure. All of them really would depend measure by measure, but it would be things perhaps like looking at one of the things that the county does already is land restoration. And one way that we could potentially account for that as sequestered carbon, and this is not an agricultural example specifically, but for land restoration for natural and open lands, we could look at the land use type. So if it was a riparian area that was restored or a wooded area, there would be potential sequestration values associated with that. So it'd be you take an acreage by a certain factor of the land use type. And I think for agriculture, and sorry, I'm not an agricultural expert, but I believe it would be a similar process for, you look at the type of cover that you have on the property, or maybe soil management programs. I'm not familiar enough with the technical details, but if we were to have, for example, a measure that said, we'll support soil management programs or soil management to capture more greenhouse gas emissions, we would need a way to monitor that. And that may be something like reporting. I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff, so I wouldn't know exactly how that would be monitored. But
well, some of the challenges I see here are, as the Jada had commented, just the cost of verification, the time involved. if the county, I guess I'm having a hard time seeing the sort of investment the county would have to make the professionals out there that are going to do this, because certainly the growers do not have the time or the resources to provide that monitoring for on behalf of the county to verify that they are actually getting reductions. So that one, and then the other comment I wanted to make was on the last mile, meaning the distribution of the organic materials, assuming it's not happening on the farm. There's a lot of compost, and Mary and I, both in the compost industry, can attest to the fact that that last mile, the cost to the growers themselves of getting the material to their site, and then the cost of applying it, particularly on the topography in the landscapes that we have in these orchards. You can sequester a lot of carbon through mulching, and most growers would mulch if they could afford it, if they could actually afford the cost to put a 3 or 4 inch layer of mulch on an avocado orchard, for example, to conserve more water. But they don't have the resources to do that right now, and the logistics or the equipment is not even available in many cases. So how does the county project, if you will, addressing that last mile, the ability to get the organics to the farms and then have the farmers apply it? I know that's a loaded question. Probably don't have an answer for it, but it's a big one.
Yeah.
That last mile is a big issue with the agriculture community that we have to pay attention to.
Well,
Absolutely.
especially with the solid waste meeting coming up, and the county, your colleagues at the county and different county departments are estimating that there'll be approximately 1 million tons of organics. And if you look and say, well, what are we going to do with 1 million tons of organics, even if we do process it with something usable? The only place to really put it that you could sequester carbon would be on rangeland. But rangeland has a return. And this is what's going back to Craig. I mean, I love numbers because I think it's really important to quantify. And rangeland has a return of under $50 per acre. Its value is rangeland. And in order to put at 1 inch layer and cover the cost of transportation and spreading, you're talking about $3,000 per acre. So what farmer would want to spend $3,000 on something that generates $50? I mean, how?
I don't see any here if you want to do that.
There's like, and you know, I don't want to sound flippant or anything, but you know, we've been talking about this for decades.
Yeah.
That if you really want to do this, then how do you figure out a way to pay for it? Because it is doable.
Well, to your point, and then to your question, this is exactly why I mentioned that we want to do a robust outreach process, because with a plan that covers such a wide variety of topics across the entire economy, all the emissions generated from the unincorporated county, that's the type of thing that we want to hear as we develop the plan. So just to give you like an idea of where we are, because I didn't go too much detail, is that we had outreach throughout last year where we asked folks about like, all right, what's your vision for the future for these emission sectors? What kind of specific actions would you like to take? What would you like incorporated in the measures? So we took all that feedback, and we also took feedback from our technical experts of, right, this is what's possible with what other agencies are doing. This is what the research shows that we can actually quantify and measure. We took all that information together. We now have it consolidated into kind of like draft conceptual measures. And at those workshops that I mentioned, we're going to share that with everybody and say, hey, here are the things here's what we heard from you. Here's what we heard from our technical experts. What do you think? Did we miss anything? What are your thoughts on how we would implement this? Did we get it right? And so I invite all of you to join that one, especially for agriculture later this summer, to tell us what we didn't get right, or to hopefully tell us we got some of the stuff right. And then I'll give you all my cards. I have a handful of them. I encourage you to email me and let me know more about this stuff. We have one planner on my team who's really well-versed in, much more so than me, in agriculture and conservation. So she can help address some of that. And then I think the hope is that we'll all kind of figure it out together, and you'll help us, overcome this. Let us know overcome the barriers. Let us know what kind of policies would be supportive of what you're talking about here. So I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah,
Or-
it's a process.
yeah.
That was actually, you just answered a lot of the question that I was wanting to ask.
Okay.
Which is, what do we expect of this workshop? And you answered that we get a chance to kind of look at what we put together from the talking session that happened last month, and probably, earlier activities as well. That's, that I've been a part of. But what would be really helpful is if we can see that and we can look at that before the workshop and have a chance to kind of digest it and put our thoughts together. If that's a possibility.
Yeah. Well, I want to say yeah, but then I'll talk with my team about it, see where we are in terms of preparing everything and just like getting it all ready. But I think that's a great idea. I think that's something that maybe I could share through, like, I don't know if it'd be Jan or if it'd be like Hannah, I know with Farm Bureau, but maybe they could distribute it. But I can't promise it right now, but I think that's a great idea.
And then just in terms of, when we do get together to talk about it, it sounds like it's going to be a virtual workshop. And, it sounds to me like, you're looking for suggestions and solutions to some of the things that, Mary and Craig are identifying as have been historical blocks, roadblocks. And, to come up with that, number one, time to look at it, prepare and respond, but also, some opportunity to kind of collaborate and work together. And, maybe Zoom is it, or maybe in-person session is a better one. Just kind of throwing that out there for people to chew on and consider.
Absolutely. If invited, we will show up. So we're in addition to so we're going to have 5 emissions workshops virtually over the next 2 months or so. And then in addition to that, we're doing what we call like focus meetings with folks, where we'll go to speak with individuals or we'll speak with groups, and we can let you know where we are and have these types of conversations in smaller group meetings. And yeah, so we're ready for that. So if invited, we'll show up and talk with you all.